Okay, thank you, everybody. In my workshop, we've had a great week. Thank you to Miles and Susan and Lorraine again for making this happen. Thank you to the members of this community, larger community, for coming and supporting this really spectacular gathering. It's been a real privilege to be with you this week. I'm just going to begin with a brief disclaimer. For whatever reason, I thought this was an hour-long assignment. So sometime in mid-December, Susan said, half an hour. So I've had to cut this thing in half. So I'm going to try to go fast, knowing that, and it's probably going to be a little bit awkward in spots, but I hope some of it will be useful to you. And there's a handout for this that's just really 2 pages, and they are excerpts from poems that I'm going to reference, and then a complete poem that I'm going to talk about at greater length. This is called Here Lies Andrew Baker. I was in high school at a time when it was still common for boys from the hinterlands to tinker around on old cars. That would often require a pilgrimage to a junkyard to get a leaf spring or a set of spider gears for a rear end assembly. One day a friend of mine needed to procure a windshield for a very large old car. 3 of us went to Boynton's Auto Salvage and discovered they in fact had a suitable replacement. The office at the junkyard was cluttered with small parts, old carburetors, ignition coils, greasy things, ashtrays, a burnt petroleum funk hung in the air like a curtain, the usual. Along one wall was a large chicken wire enclosure that was the home of a captured squirrel, whose name, I kid you not, was Shithead. The men who worked at the junkyard fed the squirrel peanuts in the shell. Shithead was a cantankerous and uncivilized pet, and one had to take care feeding him not to get a hunk pinched out of a finger. One of the men who worked at the junkyard was Ernie, a few years older than us high school boys, and therefore eminently more wise. It was Ernie's task to escort us in what was known as the yard car, up the hill to the cemetery of dead cars to help us remove the windshield. Removing a windshield requires a screwdriver and a piece of steel cable about the diameter of a pencil lead. You use the screwdriver to work the wire through the rubber gasket surrounding the glass, and then feed the wire through to the interior of the car. Then someone sits in the car and takes hold of the wire, hold of one end of the wire, and another person stands on the hood of the car holding the other end of the wire. You proceed to draw the wire back and forth like a cross-cut saw, and eventually cut through the gasket all the way around, and the windshield pops out. As one may imagine, this can be a slow process. It took us a while to get the wire through the gasket, and then it took us a while to get the hang of the pulling and the wire back and forth effectively. Eventually, though, we were sawing through the gasket in good rhythm and at a pretty good clip. Once we were moving along smoothly and feeling pleasure from our labors, Ernie called out from the hood of the car, "All boys, we're shitting in tall cotton now." It was a momentous, triumphant exclaim. And I have waited more than 30 years to find a suitable occasion to explicate Ernie's off-color yet wholly resonant metaphor. A line of poetry it ain't, but it is a genuinely poetic use of language, and barring a slightly fudged foot, It's a darn good go at pentameter. Ernie's exclaim, "All boys were shitting in tall cotton now," has stayed alive in my mind all these years. Partly for its good old boy humor, but also for more serious, dare I say, artistic reasons. What does that exclaim express? We've got this licked. We have this in the bag. We were succeeding in our task, and that success was a pleasure. We were following the normal procedure for removing a windshield from a junked car, and it was working. That's the literal meaning. But what does it mean more figuratively to shit in tall cotton? This has given me reason to wonder through the years. One can assume that if you needed to relieve yourself outdoors, you would want some privacy, so tall cotton would be an advantage. Sometimes when things are going well, one says everything is high cotton. In that instance, the saying has nothing to do with going to the bathroom, as far as I know. But to say, "Oh, boys, we're shitting in tall cotton now," would appear to mix two expressions, one of which is standard and the other of which is, shall we say, non-standard. But it's not unlike the famous scene in A Midsummer Night's Dream when Quince observes that his fellow actor Bottom has magically sprung a donkey head on his shoulders. Instead of saying, "Bottom, you've turned into a jackass," which is obvious and flat language, Quince says, "Bless thee, Bottom, bless thee, thou art translated." Now, Ernie's exclaim doesn't sound so coarse. If we imagine it in a farcically charged dramatic context, it becomes perfectly and outrageously poetic. I've always felt fortunate to have grown up with this kind of language to listen to. I hear it first, and then I get to realize its complexity, its rich use of figuration. In order to indicate frequency, or something that is often the case, my grandmother used to say something like, "Why, shucks, it's a heap of times when all a feller needs to eat is a biscuit and a little ham meat." Listen to those anapaests and I ams shouldering the lines, and the final spondy, ham meat, emphasizing the blunt fact of a hog. I was in college before I learned about metaphors and figures of speech, and how the employment of a metaphor reveals a really sophisticated understanding of the English language. Yet perhaps the presence of metaphor in everyday speech may also reveal just how complicated our language is. Thanks to metaphor, simile, alliteration, etc., we have a very rich language, one that inherently expresses ideas through non-literal means and nuance of meaning on multiple levels at once. It's as if English, by design, allows us to speak with a forked tongue. It also allows us to think with a forked mind. Here's another country yarn. A couple of summers ago, my mother and I got with a cousin and traipsed around the old family cemeteries. As the day went on, we were finding older and older ancestors buried in increasingly remote locations scattered through the southern Cumberland Mountains. We went through a place called Stab and Short Creek and Level Green and Sinking Valley, and the farm where my great-great-grandparents lived in a sparrow fart of a place called Plato. Baker's Cave is there in Plato. These names for places in geography are different than a name like Jonesville or Washington. The origin of a name like Jonesville is obvious, whereas the origin of a place named Stab encourages a fair amount of wonder and curiosity. Our last stop was a cemetery near the community of High Top, which, as the crow flies, is in the vicinity of two other nicely named communities, Keevy and Skate. It is down a gravel road and off in a glade that my oldest Kentucky ancestor, Andrew Baker, is buried. He was my great-great-great-great-great-grandfather. A roundish stone, a bit like a bust, marks his grave. He was born in 1765 and died in 1810. Carved into the stone above his dates is this curious phrase: "Here lies Andrew Baker." That's H-E-A-R, not H-E-R-E. This is on your handout. The letters on the stone look rather poetic to me. Here lies Andrew Baker. He was born Sept 29th, 1765, died Sept the 10th, 1810. I love that the person who made the grave marker was obviously illiterate. I expect the stone carver was able to recognize letters and reproduce them, but perhaps wasn't able to read words. And then there's the accidental double entendre of "here lies" that just fascinates and mesmerizes me. I feel like I know something about the mind of this anonymous stone carver, just as we glimpse the mind of Sappho from one of her fragments. The carved epitaph suggests that even at its crudest level, the English language requires structure and cannot avoid figuration. It's painting with words, and for someone who probably couldn't actually read words, being able to paint with them must have been a satisfaction. It's important to keep in mind that figurative language is not merely decoration. Figuration is, more importantly, a way to give structure to thought. One who deals in figures is not thinking according to linearity, but by leaps and by analogy. And paradoxically, a good metaphor does not express anything directly. Rather, it creates a kind of globe, a three-dimensional structure that houses thought, and not simply a single thought, but a nexus of thoughts, a space where multiple thoughts and shades of meaning coincide and are suspended in that space to be contemplated. It's similar to a bell. The bell is the house for the sound of the clapper. The bigger and more spacious the bell, the more resonant and lasting the sound. And while a figure of speech certainly reveals something about speech, more importantly, it reveals the qualities of the mind of the person who utters the speech. Figures of speech allow us to be of two minds about something, maybe multiple minds. As Wallace Stevens says in 13 Ways of Looking at a Blackbird, I was of three minds, like a tree in which there are three blackbirds. Weird stuff and wonderful. A well-heeled figure of speech is not something applied merely to the surface of language as a coat of paint. As I've suggested, a good figure seems to be part of the poem's interior design in order to house language and provide a three-dimensional structure, like a room or a sphere in which various levels and shades of meaning and even contraries all hum together in a microcosmos. The figure unifies the variety of thought and feeling created by the very use of language, and yet, as Keats says of negative capability, the unity does not seek to resolve the tensions and oppositions implied by the variety. A figure is like a bus with lots of different people on it and a few empty seats. A figure is like a boat with a couple of craggy sailors and a one-legged captain listing across the sea. A figure is like a rickety wagon with a family inside, a baby sleeping in a barrel half, a woman wearing a bonnet holding the reins, a man thinner than the handle of a rake walking beside the team of oxen clucking to keep them going. In short, a well-used figure is never static. It doesn't freeze elements of a poem, but perhaps momentarily puts them in floating suspension, a little solar system with a string of planets swirling around the heavens. I think that floating suspension effect causes the reader to pause slightly to admire and study the mesmerizing effects of the poem. While a figure is a primary building block of the larger poem, I think the figure also has an independent quality and integrity. It can hold together by itself, even if it is a briefly registered effect. If my understanding of Robert Frost's notion of the sound of sense is accurate, then I think what I'm trying to say about figuration is similar. Just as the figure houses the nexus of ideas and emotions and allows them to be contained in a unified space, the line is the house for sound. Somehow, or in the best cases, the house of space, in the best cases, the house of the figure chimes elegantly and resonantly with the house of sound, registered by the poetic line. Those lines where figure and sound sync up or coincide really stand out. They are like tones pulsing through the poem, and maybe they produce a chord, a series of tones that fall into harmony with each other. Obviously, there's a useful tension that arises from having a loaded line, one that's pregnant with figuration and ding-donging along, counterpointed by a more humbly written plain Jane line. In other words, all lines in a poem need not be great with figuration. That would come across as gaudy wallpaper, gilding the lily. Notice I cannot illuminate my observations about rhetorical figures without resorting to what else? Rhetorical figures. Go figure. Back out of all this now on junkyards and graveyards. Let's see how some of this looks in the daylight of actual poems. We'll begin with a classic, Emily Dickinson. We're all familiar with the line, "There's a certain slant of light." This is on your handout. That in itself is a version of personification. Light is assigned the qualities of an animate object. But the sentence goes on to say this: there's a certain slant of light, winter afternoons, that oppresses like the heft of cathedral tunes. Now we have many other figures deployed, two images, further personification, a simile that itself is loaded with irony and a kind of chiasmus, two instances of synecdoche and maybe more. That's a lot of figuration for a couple of lines. But I don't think these lines are over-decorated at all. In fact, they're just right. They're crafted lines. The accumulated figures are not merely descriptive either. They interpret a scene, a concept. They provide a mood. Yet all of the subordinate figures reside in the larger house of metaphor. They also show the poet's mind in the process of thought, how Dickinson's mind is nimble and precise and shimmering, caught in the moment of apprehension. Dickinson is very good at this mind in the moment of apprehension business. And her poems reveal a lively mind that is literally inspired. A spirit has come into it because the natural world itself is always in its moment of being. And that moment is also always ending. Thus, the heavenly hurt and imperial affliction Dickinson mentions later in the poem. With Dickinson, we have not only the mind of a singular poet, we have a mirror held up for anyone with a mind willing to think. We see things in that mirror. We recognize them as our own thoughts, our own imperial afflictions. That has to be one of the practical, heart-honing values of reading poetry. One of my favorite modern poems is Church Going by Philip Larkin. I expect many of you know this poem. Talk about your figuration. The title itself strikes me as a pun that immediately means multiple ways at once. It's not going to church. Why the twist on the more familiar expression? Does Larkin want us to ponder the very idea of church going? Away from Western civilization, going the way of horse-drawn buggies and parlor tunes, swallowed by the leviathan that is the modern industrial war-drunk world? That kind of reflection, coupled with Larkin's admitted skepticism, is all over this poem. The poem bears the fingerprints of innocence and an old-fashioned regard for beauty and polite custom in the face of monstrous inherent change. A little ambiguity then, and we like that. The poem begins in almost mocking understatement and slowly shifts to a more elevated tone. Ambiguity, tone, irony, these establish the mood of the poem. But there are smaller figures at work throughout, like God flowing into a handful of dust, bringing it to life. Listen to part of the first stanza. This is in the handout. Once I am sure there's nothing going on, I step inside, letting the door thud shut. Another church, matting, seats and stone and little books, sprawlings of flowers cut for Sunday. Brownish now, some brass and stuff up at the holy end, the small, neat organ, and a tense, musty, unignorable silence. The first gesture Larkin makes is onomatopoeia, that thud of the door, to indicate a sense of finality and a sense of paradoxical emptiness inside the church. Then he gives us plain information that registers as watered-down imagery, as if to say, he's seen all of this before, been there, done that. Sprawlings of flowers, though, is a phrase that cuts a deeper groove. Here, Larkin has made a sudden grammatical shift. Instead of playing its usual role as a verb, sprawlings is now wearing the costume of a noun. And the meaning of the word is shifted under Larkin's gaze. If something is sprawled out, it usually means it is spread out, widely dispersed. In Larkin's use, however, the flowers are bunched up. The rhetorical device that transfers a word out of its ordinary grammatical context to be used as a different part of speech is called anthemeria. You don't hear that one every day. But sprawlings of flowers is also a coinage, what we call a neologism, and also an instance of personification. It's as if something in the church is dimly alive, a hauntingly echoed by Larkin's recognition through synesthetic imagery of a tense, musty, unignorable silence, which also renders another use of personification. The absence is palpable, the silence makes itself heard. Larkin has entered the realm of irony and paradox, which ironically makes logical sense, given that the strands of the Judeo-Christian tradition are tangled with paradox. What is stunning to me is how Larkin clusters such a wide variety of figures around a single phrase or a single line. It's like swallows spinning over a field in summer dusk. Is Larkin just showing off? What's the point? Perhaps one point is intrinsic. Without this level of thought in which the poet's mind transforms the outer world and in turn permits the outer world to transform the mind, without this quality and character of thought, there would be little point in writing the poem. Let's look more closely at a complete poem to have a better sense of how all of this can work. I'd like to begin this little section by looking at one sentence, 5.5 lines long, from Edward Thomas's poem about walking through woods and fields called The Signpost. This is in your, I believe, the last page of your handout. Listen to all of the figuration here. I'm going to read the bold font, bold print first. The white sun is shy, and the skeleton weeds in the never dry, rough, long grasses keep white with frost at the hilltop by the finger post. The smoke of the traveler's joy is puffed over hawthornberry and hazel tuft. Let me attempt to name the figures Thomas uses in an effort to unload the density of these lines. The white sun is shy is both personification and imagery. The skeleton weeds and the never dry, rough, long grasses keep white with frost at the hilltop by the finger post is long-winded syntax that offers further personification and a painterly series of 3 images to convey the entire landscape. And the final flourish that ends the sentence and concludes the stanza is this: the smoke of the traveler's joy is puffed over hawthornberry and hazel tuft. Metaphor meets personification through the handshake greeting of imagery. We can also detect some sonic figures, a little assonance here and there, clusters of long vowel sounds, some alliteration. One may claim, though perhaps it's a stretch, that the use of puffed is an instance of onomatopoeia. Unless we overlook the obvious, these lines rhyme, which is, of course, also a figure of speech, since straight, single-minded speech does not rhyme. These are common figures, but Thomas has a few other cards up his sleeve in these lines. The braiding effect created by pairing the phrase, the hilltop by the finger post, the hilltop by the finger post, and I mean hilltop and finger post as the double emphasis of the syllables, is a kind of parallelism that works on several levels. The terms hilltop and finger post are double nouns, yet their grammatical similarity quietly clashes with the dissimilarity in scale. The hilltop is vast, whereas the finger post is small. This is a kind of chiasmus. The vastness of the hill crosses paths with the singularity of the post. Also, to describe the grasses as never dry instead of the more straight descriptor, always wet, presents the image through inversion of ordinary perception. In this case, a figure known as meiosis. We can also detect a couple of spots where Thomas is fiddling with conventional syntax, which we call inversion. The words appear to fall out of order, which delays and prevents the neat connection of the sentence's parts and serves the ambiguity at the poem's center. Considered grammatically, this is a sentence that builds intensity as it goes. The qualities of the scene Thomas is describing gradually become amplified. And in this case, the term for this special type of amplification is polysyndeton, not the most familiar term. Yet, part of my point is, we do this all the time in ordinary speech. We use polysyndeton every day, talking to someone on the phone or your spouse or your children. It's just we're not familiar that there is a technical term for what it is we're actually doing. I think we can simply agree amplification is clearly a device Edward Thomas is using. And doesn't the amplification, the feeling of rising, make perfect sense? Thomas has just walked up a hill. He's literally up. Furthermore, when Thomas references the smoke of the traveler's joy, he's pointing specifically to the seed pouch that forms on the head of the flower after it has bloomed. In this use of figure, Thomas is using a feature of the plant as a stand-in for the entire plant, indeed for a field full of these widespread flowers at the end of the season. Using a part to stand in for the whole is called synecdoche. The phrase skeleton weeds is a very rich example of metonymy. Thomas could have merely said the dead weeds, but we understand the idea of death through its stand-in, skeleton. One may even claim there is a kind of parallelism found between the white of the frost and the white of the smoke. What's more, the sun is also white, which cannot actually be true, but the phrase does give the passage a nice use of oxymoron. It's worth noting, too, that Thomas often gives us 2 for the price of 1, or even 3, nay, 4. For instance, the white sun is shy is an example of oxymoron, personification, imagery, and alliteration, all in the same breath, the same calm thought. And maybe that clash between the density of the figuration and the serenity of the language expressing the thought by the simple phrase belies a kind of paradox as well. That would make it 5. 5 figures of speech woven into 5 monosyllabic words, 5 words a child would say. Yet beyond the local or smaller figures Thomas uses in this passage, we have a larger gesture being made, and each of the smaller figures are serving it like worker bees. The larger gesture is to present the landscape in 3 dimensions as wholly embodied. The land, the scene Thomas describes, is alive. It is a living world, he gleans, and how the humans respond to that world and what that world asks of the humans in it is the nexus of considerations running through the center of the poem. And there may be some irony lurking in the shadows of the poem. It was written on December 7th, 1914. The First World War had recently reared its ghastly head. The possibility of a doomed world lurked in Thomas's mind. Thus, declaring the world to be a living thing is both a joy and a gasp of grief. This poem, incidentally, is based on an actual walk Thomas took with his friend Robert Frost, who was briefly living in England. The rich friendship the poets shared as humans and as budding poets would soon be altered. Now that I've swept away the crumbs of history, let's get back to the poem itself and the richness of its composition. Even the wildflower Thomas features in this poem has a metaphorical name, Traveler's Joy. It's also commonly known as Old Man, because in the fall it can seem as if the flower has a silky white beard. Thomas and Robert Frost are indeed the travelers in this poem, and one of the poets would live to be an old man, all right. Thomas has also done something strange in this poem. Its title is The Signpost, which is a general term that broods over the whole poem, suggesting that the idea of a signpost is considered literally and figuratively in the same thought. But in the first stanza, Thomas uses the much more local and figurative name, fingerpost. That very name conjures the image of a finger pointing, and maybe another finger pointing in a different direction. 2 roads diverged in a yellow wood, and I took the one less traveled by. Could Frost have been reflecting on this same walk? I don't know. Let's hear all of the Thomas poem to feel how eerie it becomes when reflected through the irony of history. And let me say, the irony present in the poem is masked by a great tone of understatement, which is a very practical tool for poets. Technically, the figure of speech that conveys understatement is called litotes. The understatement, the coolness of the tone, makes the emotion underneath it all the more intense. What Thomas holds back and literally keeps out of the poem makes its presence known by its absence. If my math is correct, in the 5.5 lines I've excerpted in bold print, Edward Thomas has used 28 figures of speech, 28 brushstrokes to paint these lines. Certain figures, such as imagery and personification, he has used multiple times. The use of figuration, of course, is not a counting game. Using more figures may not make the poem better, but using figures effectively always produces good results because they transfer the poem from the flat page into the mind of the reader. The reader enters the room of the poem, the three-dimensional space of the poem, and has a seat at the table prepared with a bowl of irony before him and a nice warm cup of metaphor. Here's the entire poem. The signpost. The dim sea glints chill. The white sun is shy, and the skeleton weeds and the never dry, rough, long grasses keep white with frost at the hilltop by the finger post. The smoke of the traveler's joy is puffed over hawthornberry and hazeltuft. I read the sign. Which way shall I go? A voice says, you would not have doubted to. You would not have doubted so at 20. Another voice, gentle with scorn, says, at 20, you wished you had never been born. One hazel lost a leaf of gold from a tuft at the tip. When the first voice told the other he wished to know what 'twould be to be 60 by this same post. You shall see, he laughed, and I had to join his laughter. You shall see. But either before or after, whatever happens, it must befall a mouthful of earth to remedy all regrets, and wishes shall freely be given. And if there is a flaw in that heaven, 'twill be freedom to wish. And your wish may be to be here or anywhere talking to me, no matter what the weather, on earth, at any age between death and birth, to see what day or night can be, the sun and the frost, the land and the sea, summer, autumn, winter, spring, with the poor man of any sort, down to a king, standing upright out in the air, wondering where he shall journey. Oh, where? Obviously, more figures follow from the ones I've observed in the first stanza. This is pretty much a tour de force and an intricate revelation of craft, and I haven't so much as pricked the flirtatious purity of Thomas's meter. That feature of the poem will have to nibble like a gray donkey in the pasture of another discussion. To be interested in listening for figures of speech and then to stitch such figures into your writing doesn't require one to become egg-headed or stiffer than a Victorian corset. Figuration is just the opposite of stiffness and elitism. It's fun, this wordplay. It's the essence of the craft of poetry. To use figuration well requires looseness and flexibility of thought. The mind that works in figures is agile and capacious. It isn't full of papery information, it's full of machinery, like a block and tackle gizmo, Archimedes' lever, a trusty hoist, a turnbuckle or two, a wedge, a hank of piano wire, a pocket knife. It's in the hallowed halls of figuration, the rational and the irrational meet, the literal and the analogical discover their kinship. The imaginary, the remembered, and the actual coalesce in the dreamy room built by figures on the page. All of the smaller figures of speech, simile, synecdoche, metonymy, looping gestures such as allusion, and even sonic devices such as alliteration and assonance, derive from two big daddy figures, namely metaphor and irony. After all, metaphor draws the language, associations, and significances from one thing and infuses them into something very different, just as some fancy liquor is infused with apricot. And to offer that kind of two for the price of one gesture, that doubling of meaning, requires one to utilize irony, not in a cheap, smart-aleck way, but irony used as a vehicle to provide an expansive vision and interpretation of the things of the world. For instance, when I described the village of Plato, Kentucky as a sparrow fart, the basic metaphor works like a magnet and carries with it other figures such as personification, synecdoche, understatement, and in crude form, imagery. And all of that is cloaked in irony to make the association between a country village and the flatus of a common songbird is ironic to the point of being ludicrous. And yet, the point of the association is clearly, if rudely, conveyed. Figurative speech is not a decorative use of language, rather it's a geometric use of language. In this discussion, I've attempted to demonstrate the richness of figurative speech by overusing it, by exaggerating it. That's hyperbole, another figure of speech. By utilizing figures of speech in the discussion of figuration, my task has not been a chore at all. Instead, it has been an abiding pleasure. A good dog has been by my side, and a fire has glowed in the old stove. I've told a couple of stories, one saucy, the other grave, anecdotes. And in doing so, I've resorted to similes, personification, euphemism, anaphora, allusion, imagery, alliteration, assonance, consonance, irony, metaphor, understatement, metonymy, synecdoche, and Lord knows what else. I've thrown in everything but the kitchen sink, every tool in the shed, the whole shebang, whatever a shebang is, the big enchilada. Perhaps we've glimpsed the misty summit of Parnassus, and we've looked at lines from a handful of poems that use figurative language to great effect. I often think a well-placed or well-conceived figure in a poem is like dropping a stone into a pool of water. The rings of resonance radiate outward, and if the pool of water were large enough, and the outward moving rings would go on infinitely. And yet, exactly what each figure means or connotes or suggests is often shrouded in a veil of ambiguity. Figures of speech refine and intensify meaning, but they don't necessarily make it precise or crystal clear. Figures draw blurry lines by design. Here comes that old irony again. That veil of ironic ambiguity is necessary in art and in life. Think of that coy Mona Lisa smile. Or is she smiling? Thank you.